I haven't had a chance to say welcome, everyone, and welcome to you all. And I'm thrilled how things are going so far. Thank you, speakers. Many of you have been to Knepp, so a lot of you have heard me talk about what I think we're doing here. What I'm now going to talk about is the financial information that we're working on in terms of why we think we're okay in terms of what we're doing to our land. And I suppose this is very important to understand because we need to be able to encourage other people to think the same way, perhaps if they got the same sorts of resources, the same sorts of things that I have. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of back history of Knepp and why we made the decisions we were going to make, but also a little bit of the information about the financial stability of the whole enterprise. This is Knepp in 1941. My uncle stands there. He's now 80 years old. My father, my aunts standing there. The picture you're looking at is the result of 20 years of land abandonment. It's a picture showing that this sort of land came out of agriculture and reverted to scrubland. Big bits of hawthorn and so on. It's a picture that shows you that this sort of land perhaps was the first sort of land that came out of agriculture. And I suppose that was very important to our decision-making of what we were then faced with after 17 years of farming. John Burton, a physician in the 18th century, was wandering around Sussex and the whole of Britain. He wandered around and wrote all he saw and thought about. And he described Sussex in a very interesting way. He came to Sussex and he found that the long-leggedness in the oxen, the swine, and the women was particularly marked. And he came to the conclusion that they were probably long-legged because the clay, the pulling of your legs out of the clay the whole time gave you this thing. In ancient Sussex dialects, we have, like the Inuits, the Inuits having their language for snow, we have 30 words for clay in Sussex. This all feeds into this idea that this land is perhaps marginal. It's not going to be the best land for production to compete with commodities. During the war effort, the park, the Repton Park around the castle was ploughed up. And I suppose, I went to Cirencester. I came out of Cirencester after that, and part of the Green Revolution, the 1970s Green Revolution, I always thought that it would have probably all been ploughed up. I never sort of really thought about what it may have looked like before it had been ploughed up, before the war. And I suspect a lot of us really have lost that ability to understand what that landscape looked like. And of course, we've grown up with this. This is what I grew up with. This is what I inherited, this landscape which had been ploughed up. The trees, if they were lucky, were surviving in the middle of this landscape. This landscape was where we thought nature was underneath the trees, was in the hedgerows, but we didn't really think much about nature. It wasn't really part of what we were thinking about. We were just thinking about making profits and making margins and making the whole land work for us. The map shows Knepp before the Rewilding project. And this map, the dark brown is just arable ground. The beige color is the land that was grassland and arable. And the light blue was the Repton Park. That was the historic landscape park. That was the listed park. But that was also all ploughed up, all used for different cropping systems. If we go back to the 1970s, the beginning of the Green Revolution, this graph shows us the green is the national UK average for winter wheat yields, and the blue is the winter wheat for Knepp. And we start off at pretty well the same place, but over time we start to drift away. As the Green Revolution kicked in, the fertilizers, the new plants that we were having to plant, this sort of land became more and more clearly less favoured. It was a less favoured bit of ground. And by the end of by the end of the 90s, we were then looking at an arable business that was having to compete with all the different, not only UK averages, but also all the commodities being produced around the world, the globe. And so we were producing our meagre amounts of grain per hectare, and we were trying to compete against all these other things. And so it was becoming clear that we just couldn't carry on, and we were losing money. The same story for the milk. Milk prices were collapsing, the dairy industry was in turmoil, the monopoly had been broken up. We were looking at milk quota being very valuable, but we thought that that might be at risk. We had cows, which we thought were going to be at risk in terms of value. So we were looking at all these things very bleakly into the end of the 90s. And we were then having to consider putting a lot of money into our dairy industry. We gave a really hard look at what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, but we decided we were going to come out of agriculture. We thought that we just couldn't continue competing in this commodity world after 17 years of history. My father had always told me that either you're going to farm, and if you're going to farm, sell up, move, go to somewhere where there's good farmland, and then farm. If you're not going to move, and I wasn't really wanting to move, he said, ring the whole bloody lot and ranch it. Now, he wasn't meaning ranch it for wildlife, he was meaning ranch it in terms of his Australian background. Ted introduced me to this guy here, Vera. There he is. And we started to discuss and think and look at all these different ideas that the mostly Dutch, actually, were coming up with. And because I'd been brought up in Africa and Australia and was used to these big dynamic systems, it was sort of second nature to me. What France was telling me was, oh, well, that, yeah, well, obviously. It was that easy. It was, you know, it was an easy leap for me to make, what he was telling me. So I thought, well, okay, we'll come back to the UK and have a look at how we could do this on our own land. Knepp now looks like this. Now, from 1941, when all that scrub was being pulled out, and the only bit that wasn't scrubbed up was the home farm, and that was about 700 acres. So the rest of the land had scrubbed up. And it looked like this. And this is what it looks like now. One difference now is we have, and as we've heard, the drivers of all these systems seem to be these animals. So the one difference we have now is these animals back in the landscape, affecting that vegetation, affecting the pulse, affecting all those things. And that's what we're going to have a quick look at this afternoon before cocktails. How it works, if you look at a partial budget, if you take the land as a farm, a home farm, and all the assets that belong to that farming operation, if you look at all those assets and then work out how can you employ those assets, and how can you re-look at those figures to work out, actually, will this be a sustainable way of thinking about changing from conventional farming, in-hand farm, to a non-conventional rewilding project? First thing, which is incredibly important, was Natural England came up with a whole load of cash that was to do with environment. At risk, obviously. 10-year, we run out in 2020. We have a basic payment. And for those of you who don't know what a basic payment is, anyway, you're lost, because you do need to know what that one is. At risk. Everyone gets that. Everyone gets that payment, but it is at risk. If you imagine we've got all these farm buildings, the one that you're sitting in today, we've got all these farm buildings, and we've done about 117,000 foot of converting these farm buildings. And that's cost a lot of capital. We've had to borrow money, and some of the borrowed money is over a 7-year period or maybe a 20-year period, depending on the complexity and the cost of conversion. But we have converted about 117,000 foot. And that's bringing in about £450,000 revenue a year. 198 full-time jobs being created in those little businesses, now renting out those properties. Now, we're in the southeast of England. We are squashed between London, Brighton, Worthing. We're in one of the most populated bits of the country, or in Europe. So this is what we have done, but it couldn't, you may not be able to do this in Norfolk or whatever. Because we've gone from 11 men employed on the home farm to one poor Pat, where is he? You'll be going out with him later on. Poor Pat's on his own. He has got a few people that he can bring in and help him. But we've released a whole lot of cottages and houses because of that. And that brings in a revenue. So that becomes a change in how we looked at the estate. And that money now can go against the cost of looking after those cottages and maybe making a bit of a profit. We still produce a lot of meat. So 75 tons of meat, or 75 tons of live weight is produced. 35 tons of meat is produced from the project. So a lot of meat, organic, pasture-fed, free-ranging meat. Tourism, that's a new venture for us. This is our third year. You've seen the campsite. You've had a quick look at it. That turned over 180,000 last year. It probably didn't make any money last year, but there was a second full year. This year we're hoping to do about 220,000, 230,000 pound turnover. And eventually we think that business with the safaris and the glamping and the camping might make as much profit as we averagely made on the farm for the 17 years that I was commercially farming. And that's from 10 acres. And a capital employed of about 350,000. So really interesting, isn't it? Suddenly, a little tiny business based on nature and selling nature to people suddenly makes as much money as a big commercial farm with 600 dairy cows and all the rest of it. By not having to worry about the farm and the people that were employed on the farm because we were losing money and always trying to scrabble around trying to make a buck or trying to change enterprises and all the different pressures that you have when you are in a loss-making business. When you stop doing it, it releases an enormous amount of time. So what I'm now doing is I've got interests in doing things on the estate, but I've also got interests out of the estate, and I'm doing things like this, talking to you guys, taking people around Knepp, but also I sit on lots of different boards now and involved in lots of European projects, and there's a whole load of other things that I've been able to do, which certainly wasn't capable, or no one wanted me anyway, but at least I've got a story to tell now. But it's also meant that the estate has become a very diversified rural business. So we've got a lot going on in the let property sector. You've got obviously the farming, which is the Rewilding project, and the deer enterprises and cattle. You've got leisure, which is this thing which I'm talking about, is growing, and we do weddings and other things as well. We do fairs and that type of thing. We do a bit of renewable energy, so we do quite a lot of rooftop photovoltaics, and you've seen a voltaic field next door here, and we've got biomass boilers and that sort of thing. We've also rolling out broadband to ourselves, our cottages, but also to local people as well, so that's another project. Just to give you some comparisons of what Knepp looks like against some of our peers, for about 20 years now, we've been feeding information into the benchmarking system, the Savills benchmarking system. And it's a very complex, big task. It takes Jason, in fact he did it last weekend, it took him 3 days to fill in the forms. And we've been doing that for 20 years. So these figures are coming from the Savills research team, and we're just looking at our figures compared to theirs. So if you're looking at last year's income of all estates in the benchmarking system, there's about 1 million acres in the benchmarking system, and that's split between England and Scotland. You'd have to sort of dive in a bit deeper to find out where the figures come from. But we're doing £133 an acre, and this is without the partial budget figures. This is not with the rents coming in from buildings or the rents coming in from cottages. This is just purely what's going, and the tourism. So it's just purely comparative data against like-for-like home farms within the survey. This is what we looked like over time, and the red line is Knepp, and the blue line is the UK average, and you can see the roller coaster ride that we've been experiencing. But it's all explainable. At this period, we gave up our conventional farming, and we had the big farm sale. We then went into a period of contract farming on most of the land. We had started the Rewilding project in that we had done a park restoration around the house, a Repton Park restoration. Then we went into a period of conversion to organic, and then HLS kicking in, and then we became quite stable. So if we look on a national level, the subsidies and the meat production and the whole farming enterprise looks pretty well stable, but also following national averages. So comfort there. Comfort that I'm not completely mad, and it hasn't been a completely wrong decision-making. And we can then add back into those figures the added rent that we can get from farm buildings, the added rent that we can get from cottages. So suddenly, and then the tourism, suddenly you're beginning to think, now it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? You're making more money than you were doing something else. This is just to bring it down to regional scale. So we're just having a look at the regional scales. This is using DEFRA figures. So this is Knepp over the last 12 years. So this is the period when we went all out to do the Rewilding project. And so you've got the Knepp figures here. This is profit per hectare. So it's pounds per hectare, the profit margin. So this is looking at the arable sector, the cereal sector, against what we're doing. This is looking at the dairy sector against what we're doing. Poor dairymen, look at that. Poor. And the most relevant, I suppose, to us is livestock farming, lowland livestock grazing. Now, I know Philip Merricks is in the room, and he's got 800 cows on lowland. I bet she's making more money than that. Hi, Philip. And I don't know what the data set is for the DEFRA figures, so I'm a little bit at a loss at why these figures look so weird. But again, for us, comfort-wise, we're comparing ourselves with our region. We're doing very well indeed. A couple of threats that are coming down our way, economic threats these are, and one of them is that there's 1,000 acres of scrubland forming down here. So cross-compliance is a real problem. It's a real worry for Jason, mostly, because he has to worry about it. And that cross-compliance worry, I'm assuming that most of you know what high-level stewardship is and basic payment schemes are. These are obviously at risk. If we fail on cross-compliance, then we lose our HLS. That's how it stands. Just to give you some examples, this is 12 years ago, this was a corner of a wheat field. So this is Knepp. It's not the Amazon jungle. It is Knepp, and it was taken a couple of weeks ago, this photograph. Permanent ineligible features, PIFs and TIFs, temporary ineligible features, and impenetrable scrub, and all the different things that you have to learn about to understand what cross-compliance may mean for one. For years, we've got quite a lot of them in the audience, a group of people that were on our advisory board, and they were able to get a derogation for allowing this to happen, the scrub to happen. That may have run out, I don't know. I don't know what would happen if we got inspected. But this fight between the basic payment fight from the Rural Payments Agency, and then you got the Pillar 2 fight for nature, clash enormously. So here we are, encouraged to produce this sort of stuff for nature. Penny found 18 scarce chasers in that newly created scrape last year. Very rare dragonfly, I believe. That permanent ineligible feature, which is the pond or the scrape, that goes for the all the other ponds we've built, all the different things we've done to floodplains, all the changes in river systems we've made, they're all ineligible. They have to be taken out, and you then get them subtracted from your payments. Hardly an advertisement for actually producing habitats for nature, is it? Then you've got the impenetrable scrub, and that has to be taken out. And these we don't consider impenetrable, and we don't consider them long-term. You're all aware of how these things happen. These bits of, these pulses, they come and go, and short-term, and it's not permanent in any way. But these are considered permanent, because you're looking down from Google Earth and from the RPA, and you're then seeing these permanent structures. But actually, if you crawl into them, you'll find the cattle there, the horses there, the pigs there. You're finding the sallow being eaten by all these different animals. Then they're being utilized. They're all part of the system. Trackways. Trackways, we don't want people driving off tracks. So these are just where vehicles are driven up and down, and they become permanent ineligible features. There's 12 miles of them just in the southern block. We have to measure them and then retract them from our basic payments. And that's really just to keep people off the ground, so they're not crushing anthills and killing insects and birds. So it's all a bit weird, isn't it? We've got to think about this one and how we can change this in the future. Both the HLS and the basic payments is certainly under risk. And I've tried to read Dieter Helm's book twice now. And I've only ever got 3/4 of the way through it. And then sort of look to people like Christopher Price and hope that he can understand it so he can tell us what's going on. Where does Knepp fit into this new idea of natural capital and ecosystem services? How is it actually going to work for us? We'd love to know, in plain, not Dieter Helm English. I'd love to know. And are we going to be beneficiaries of that? Is the Knepp project going to be something in the future after Brexit is going to be receiving something from natural capital and the flow to us of ecosystem services? I don't know. I'd love to know. One last thought. One of the main stoppers for talking to lots of landowners and farmers about allowing space for nature on their land, one of the main stoppers is regulation. Regulation, when you make a change, like you plant a wood, it has to stay as a wood forever. If you have long-term grassland, it has to stay long-term grassland. If you allow scrub to appear and it becomes a very important habitat for all these different species, you're basically stuck in that pattern. You can't get out of it, because if you try to destroy it, they'd slap an SSI on you, or there'd be there's a feeling that you'd be controlled in some way. So this is a huge stopper for landowners and farmers. So if you can come up with an idea that actually breaks this cycle, then that might be a way forward of actually how we can come up with vegetation pulses in our landscape. So this idea of pop-up NEPs, this is Will Wren's idea, ex-Natural England guy, ex in that he's retired, and he came up with this idea. If we go into that scrub, so we did about 15 hectares of this to that scrub, perhaps what we can do is think about having these pulses coming up into a landscape that are orchestrated by someone, government, one presumes, allowing a 25-year period where the scrub can come, and at the end of the 25-year period, the landowner, the farmer, can decide to come out of it. It's an intergenerational thing. If they've got a feeling that they can come out of it without no penalties, then they might want to do it because they could restore their soils. They might want to do it because they're going to get organic matter back in their soils. They might get the mycorrhizal fungi working again. They might get the worms and the bacteria and everything functioning again. And then their restored soils can then go into what will then be probably a much more enlightened farming regime. So that was just an idea for a pop-up NEP and allowing that sort of thing to happen in this sort of landscape. That's it really for me. Thank you very much for listening. And I think I've got Penny.